It began with a whisper across the Pacific, a rumor, a legend, a name spoken quietly among sailors who had seen the impossible and survived to tell it. The story of a battleship that history overlooked. A steel giant that never received the glory it deserved despite fighting in the most violent, unforgiving waters of the Second World War. And as the sun rose over the endless blue horizon, turning the ocean's surface into a field of molten gold, the silhouette of that forgotten titan cut through the mist like a ghost. Sleek, armored, bristling with guns yet overshadowed by the fame of its more celebrated sisters. A vessel that carried the weight of war but never the applause of victory. And on this particular morning, as the crew stood at their battle stations, sweat mixing with salt spray, hearts pounding like drums of war, they could feel it. Something was coming, something massive, something deadly, a threat lurking beyond the curtain of haze. And the captain's voice thundered across the deck, ordering engines to full power, the great boilers awakening with a low, ominous roar, as radar operators leaned over glowing screens, tracking shapes that flickered and vanished like phantoms, and deep inside the ship, machinists and gunners prepared for the kind of combat that tested not just steel but souls, because the Pacific had a way of swallowing stories whole, burying courage beneath waves and wreckage. And today, the men of this unrecognized battleship felt the weight of destiny pressing against their ribs, the air humming with electricity as the sea began to heave, as if preparing itself for the steel-on-steel collision that would define their lives. And then, just as the first alarm sounded, the fog split open, revealing distant flashes of muzzle fire, the thunder of unseen guns rolling across the water like a storm surge. And in that instant, the crew understood that they were alone, cut off, outnumbered, facing a threat no other ship wanted to face. Yet they stood ready, muscles tensed, breathing sharp, eyes locked on the horizon, because this ship, ignored by historians, overshadowed by legends, had always thrived in the shadows, always fought without applause, always delivered more than anyone expected. And as enemy shells screamed through the air and slammed into the sea with geysers of white spray, the forgotten battleship turned its bow toward danger with the stubborn, unbreakable defiance of a warrior who had never been honored but refused to die quietly. And the next moments unfolded with terrifying speed. Gunners spinning turrets toward flickers of enemy fire, shells loading with mechanical precision, rangefinders locking onto targets hidden by mist and chaos. The entire ship transforming into a living engine of war as alarms echoed. Men shouted orders, steel trembled, and the Pacific erupted into the kind of battle that would have made newspaper headlines if anyone had bothered to write them, because this ship was a ghost in the official histories. A powerhouse no one talked about, a guardian that fought without recognition, and now, facing overwhelming firepower, it was about to prove once again why it deserved its place among the greatest warships of the Second World War. And as the first volleys left the barrels in blinding flashes, shaking the entire hull as the ocean around them exploded into chaos, as the crew braced themselves for a duel they should not have survived, one truth became clear. History may have forgotten this battleship, but the sea never did. And on this day, this violent, fate-driven day, it would carve its legacy not into textbooks, but into the raw, unforgiving memory of war itself, a legend forged in thunder, smoke, and fire, a story that demanded to be told, and a hook so powerful that no viewer could look away from what was about to unfold next. And as the first thunderous salvo roared across the Pacific, the entire hull of the unrecognized battleship shuddered with raw, unrestrained force, steel ribs groaning as columns of smoke curled upward into the brightening sky, the recoil reverberating through every deck plate and bulkhead, sending vibrations deep into the bones of the men who clung to their stations with white-knuckled tension, knowing that each second could be their last, because the enemy guns were firing faster now, their muzzle flashes strobing through the fog like lightning, each blast followed by the distant whistle of incoming shells that tore the sky apart before slamming into the ocean with towering plumes of water that drenched the guns' crews and rattled open hatches. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the overwhelming barrage that should have driven them into panic, the crew of this overlooked warship moved with a precision born of repetition, fear, and an unspoken bond forged in the darkest hours of naval warfare, their bodies reacting before their minds had time to process, each man trusting the others implicitly as they loaded massive shells into the turrets, adjusted elevation wheels, recalibrated fire control systems, and relayed enemy coordinates with voices that trembled only from the recoil of the guns, but never from fear. While the bridge pulsed with electric urgency, officers gripping charts and radios, tracking movements on radar that blinked in and out like ghosts. The contact points shifting wildly as the enemy attempted to flank, encircle, and overwhelm them, because this ship, for all its strength, was alone. And alone at sea was a death sentence unless every man performed at the absolute peak of his ability. And deep inside the ship, the engine crews worked in suffocating heat, sweat pouring down their faces as they fed the boilers, adjusted pressure valves, coaxed the engines for every ounce of speed they could give, knowing that a moment's hesitation or mechanical failure could doom everyone aboard, while above them the deck became a battlefield unto itself. The air thick with smoke and salt, the sky streaked with the scream of tracer fire as enemy aircraft burst through the fog in a sudden horrifying swarm, their engines wailing like banshees as they dove toward the battleship with bombs already falling. And in those impossible seconds, the ship's anti-aircraft batteries erupted with deafening fury, the gunners firing so fast that the barrels glowed a dull orange, tracers arching upward in slashing lines that tore into the low-hanging mist, lighting it in flashes of crimson and gold as the aircraft screamed overhead, dropping payloads that whistled through the air before crashing dangerously close, each explosion sending jagged shards of steel and wood flying across the deck. Yet the ship held the line, driving forward, refusing to yield, refusing to break, its bow slicing the waves with relentless determination even as the ocean churned violently beneath it. And through this chaos, the captain remained a pillar of absolute focus, barking orders with the iron steadiness of a man who understood that history would never remember his name, but would damn him if he failed. His eyes locked on the horizon, searching for the real threat, the heavy guns that hid behind the fog, the enemy battleship that intelligence claimed wasn't in these waters, the Leviathan whose presence would explain the unnatural precision of the enemy fire. And then, suddenly, the fog parted just enough to reveal a towering silhouette, a monstrous blade of steel emerging from the mist like a titan awakened, its massive triple turrets already turning, its hull knifing through the water with dreadful confidence. And the crew of the unrecognized American battleship felt a collective chill run through them, because they were staring at a ship that outgunned them, outweighed them, and had been designed for one purpose: obliteration. And yet there was no retreat, no reinforcements, no miracle cavalry rushing in from beyond the horizon. There was only this ship, this forgotten warrior, and the men who served on her standing between that enemy behemoth and the fragile supply routes the entire Pacific campaign depended on. And as the enemy guns flashed, enormous blossoms of flame that lit the fog from within, the captain made a decision so daring it bordered on madness, ordering a full-speed charge directly into the jaws of the enemy's firing range, a maneuver that would either save the fleet or doom them instantly. And the crew obeyed without hesitation, bracing themselves as the engines roared to full power, as the ship surged forward with a sudden acceleration that shook loose rust and dust from the rafters below deck, as the enemy shells screamed toward them like fiery comets, each one threatening to end their story before it could even be told. And in that moment, as the forgotten battleship rushed headlong toward the greatest threat it had ever faced, every man aboard felt the weight of history pressing against his shoulders, a silent understanding that what they did in the next minutes would determine whether their ship remained, a ghost in forgotten logs, or finally earned the recognition it deserved through an act of courage so impossible that even the ocean itself seemed to draw its breath in anticipation of what was to come. And as the unrecognized battleship thundered forward, charging into the kill zone with a bravery so reckless it bordered on mythical, the sea around her erupted into chaos, towering pillars of white water exploding upward as enemy shells slammed into the waves with bone-shaking force, drenching the deck in icy spray while fragments of steel hissed past the sailors' faces like angry specters. Yet not a single man faltered. Not a single hand hesitated on a wheel, lever, or firing mechanism, because in that accelerating heartbeat of war, the entire ship seemed to transform into a single living entity, every bolt, every gear, every muscle, every breath aligned toward one impossible goal: survive the storm and strike back. And the enemy Titan, looming through the mist, fired again, its triple turrets belching fire as shells the size of small cars arced across the sky with a howl that cut through wind and thunder, each projectile carrying enough force to rip the battleship in half. But still the American ship pressed closer, narrowing the distance using speed as a weapon, closing the gap before the enemy could adjust for the rapid advance. And inside the gun turrets, the crews worked like possessed men, sweat streaming down soot-covered faces as they slammed massive shells into breaches, closed locks, spun elevation wheels, and waited for fire control to feed the next impossible calculation, the ship shuddering violently each time its own guns thundered in reply, sending 14-inch shells tearing through the fog toward the distant steel giant. And though they could not yet see the impact, they felt the momentum shift, felt the energy of defiance ripple through the hull like a spark igniting the spirit of every soul aboard. And below deck, the engine room had become a furnace of heat and tension. Men stripped to undershirts, faces flushed red as they shoveled, tightened valves, adjusted feeds, and fought to keep the boilers roaring at maximum output, their muscles burning with exertion as the ship demanded more and more power, thrusting herself toward her enemy with the unwavering ferocity of a cornered predator. And all the while the fog coiled around them, rolling in thick curtains that distorted distance, hiding threats until the last possible second, turning the battlefield into a shifting maze where instinct and training mattered far more than what could be seen with the naked eye. And in this ghostly arena, the ship's radar operators fought their own battle, sweeping through interference, tracking faint blips that flickered on screens like dying stars, calling out ranges to the bridge with clipped urgency, their voices rising and falling with each adjustment the gunners made as they aligned their monstrous barrels with targets most men could only imagine. And then, a scream from above deck as an enemy salvo struck dangerously close, the blast rocking the ship hard to port, metal screaming as a secondary explosion tore through the fog just off their bow, shockwaves ripping across the deck, sending several men sprawling while fire control systems flickered from the electrical surge. But the men scrambled back to their stations before the echoes faded, dragging hoses, sealing ruptured lines, forcing the ship to remain in the fight even as sparks rained from overhead conduits. Because defeat was not an option, not here, not now, not with the fate of an entire convoy resting on the shoulders of a warship that history would later pretend did not exist. And as another enemy barrage roared over them, the air itself vibrating with murderous intent, the captain gave an order so bold it jolted even the most battle-hardened sailors: turn hard toward the enemy, close the distance even further, and fire every gun that could be brought to bear. A maneuver so dangerous it would place them within the exact range the enemy battleship wanted, but also the only range where their own guns could punch through armor thick enough to shrug off lesser firepower. And the helmsman, his hands shaking with adrenaline, spun the wheel with controlled force as the massive ship leaned into the turn, the hull groaning under the stress while waves slammed against her armored flanks. And without waiting for confirmation, the gunners unleashed another devastating broadside. The blast wave so powerful it rattled teeth, sent tools clattering across metal floors, and illuminated the fog in a blinding white flash that captured the silhouette of the enemy giant looming just ahead, its own gun still turning far too slowly to counter the sudden closing maneuver. And in that impossible moment, a fleeting heartbeat in a sea of chaos, the men realized they had seized the advantage. However briefly, and the battleship surged forward with renewed fury, engines roaring, guns blazing, the entire ship wrapped in fire, thunder, smoke, and defiance, roaring into the jaws of a war machine built to destroy her, ready to carve her name into history not through recognition, not through glory, but through survival earned in blood, steel, and the deafening symphony of war echoing across the fog-shrouded Pacific. And as the unrecognized battleship plunged deeper into the deadly fog, her bow slicing through swells that rose like dark, mountainous shadows, The men aboard felt the air tighten around them, the atmosphere charged with the raw electricity of impending impact. For they were now so close to the enemy Titan that the thunder of its guns no longer echoed. They hammered, concussive and immediate, the shock waves slamming into the hull like invisible fists, rattling the teeth of every sailor and sending vibrations down into the lowest compartments where the engine crews fought to keep the ship alive. And above deck the world became a kaleidoscope of fire, smoke, mist, and steel, the enemy silhouette appearing and vanishing in fragments between curtains of fog as the two giants closed the gap with terrifying inevitability. And with each flash of lightning-like muzzle fire, the American battleship unleashed her own wrath, her turrets vomiting flame in synchronized fury, 3-gun salvos that tore through the mist like meteor showers, each shell carving a fiery arc toward the enemy hull. And the moment the rounds left the barrels, the gunners reloaded with mechanical desperation, sweat and soot streaking their faces as they braced for the recoil of the next blast. And deep inside the fire control tower, officers shouted coordinates, adjusted elevation data, recalibrated range against shifting fog density, their fingers flying across dials as they fought the blind monster of uncertainty, knowing that a single miscalculation could mean wasted shots they could not afford. And all the while the ship shook, rocked, convulsed under the violent rhythm of exchanging fire, each impact, near or far, reverberating through bulkheads with a bone-chilling metallic scream. And still the crew pressed forward, driven not by glory but by necessity, the instinctive understanding that no one else was coming. No reinforcements would crest the horizon. No famous battleship or celebrated fleet carrier would arrive in time to save them. It was them, and only them, standing between the enemy Titan and the fragile supply lifeline of the Pacific War. And the ocean, sensing the magnitude of the confrontation, roared beneath them with storm-like fury, waves slamming against the armored hull with such force they sent sprays of icy salt water shooting across the deck, drenching men who wiped their eyes and continued loading shells, adjusting sights, manning hoses to douse fires igniting from shrapnel. Because in this inferno of steel and water there was no pause, no breath, no reprieve, only the relentless beat of war hammering itself into every fiber of the ship. And then, finally, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the broadside of the enemy battleship, a monstrous wall of metal bristling with gun barrels and antennas, her armored belt glistening with condensation and the scorch marks of earlier hits. And the American crew saw firsthand the full scale of the beast they faced. A ship larger, heavier, more heavily armored, built for aggression and domination, yet now reeling slightly from the unexpected ferocity of the attack. Her crew scrambling as the unrecognized U.S. battleship pressed closer with the fearless momentum of a vessel that had everything to prove and nothing left to lose. And in that heartbeat of clarity, the captain seized the opening, ordering a full broadside at point-blank naval distance. A command so bold it sent a jolt through the entire ship as gunners braced themselves. Fire control teams locked in, and the massive turrets adjusted their final fractions of a degree. And when the order was executed, the entire ship roared, not metaphorically but physically, her guns erupting in an explosion of sound and flame so powerful that it punched a shock wave across the sea, flattening waves and momentarily clearing the fog, revealing the enemy hull in stark detail as the American shells slammed into her with devastating precision, tearing through armor, igniting fuel stores, shattering steel plates, sending debris shooting skyward as secondary explosions cascaded along her midsection, and the enemy, Giant lurched, listing subtly, wounded for the first time. Her return fire faltering under the unexpected blow, and the American crew erupted in a brief, fierce cheer that was swallowed instantly by the next blast as a retaliatory shell tore past their bow, exploding so close it threw several sailors off their feet and sheared railing from the deck. But the ship held on, refusing to be cowed, refusing to yield, pushing forward with engines screaming under the strain as the captain barked new coordinates, demanding another crippling volley before the fog swallowed them again. And the men moved faster, harder, more desperately, reaching deep into reserves of strength they did not know they possessed, their minds locked into the rhythm of survival, their hearts pounding in unison with the thunder of the guns, because they could sense it now, that the tide was turning, that this forgotten warship, this uncelebrated machine of steel and sweat, was writing a chapter of valor that history would never properly record, and as sparks flew, as metal screamed, as smoke choked the air and waves slammed against armor, the ship surged ahead once more, ready to deliver the blow that would alter the fate of the Pacific battle unfolding in the mist. And as the battered, unrecognized American battleship surged forward again, her engines roaring like caged thunder beneath the decks, every man aboard felt the shift, not in the wind nor in the waves, but in the very spirit of the ship itself, a rising force, a defiant heartbeat pulsing through steel and sweat and fire, urging them onward toward their monstrous adversary whose silhouette flickered violently in the thinning fog, its once perfect lines now scarred with gashes torn open by the devastating broadside they had just delivered. And yet the enemy Titan refused to fall, turning her massive turrets with grinding determination, her barrels glowing red from repeated firing, preparing to unleash another hellish salvo that could break the American ship in two. But before she could fire, the unrecognized battleship's crew acted with instinctive precision honed through fear and fury, reloading their own guns at breakneck speed, gunners shouting coordinates while loaders slammed the next colossal rounds into place, their bodies straining under the weight, muscles burning as they forced the shells into breeches that clanged shut like iron jaws, the turrets turning with deep hydraulic growls as the ship angled herself once again into the perfect firing position. And high above in the fire-control tower, officers wiped grime from their eyes, tracking the enemy's movements through streaked glass and trembling instruments, adjusting firing tables with trembling fingers that refused to slow even as the air vibrated with the bass of distant explosions, because they knew that the next minute would decide everything, whether they broke the enemy giant or were broken by it. And on the open deck, sailors scrambled to their stations, some bringing spare shells, some manning damage control hoses, others dragging wounded comrades behind steel bulkheads as shrapnel hissed overhead like angry hornets, the chaos of battle blending into a continuous roar of flame, metal, and human grit. And then the enemy's guns flashed, a monstrous triple-barrel blast that tore the fog apart and sent 3 shells screaming toward the American ship like blazing meteors. And in that instant, every man braced for impact, heartbeats suspended in the air, breaths caught in throats. The only sound the whistle of incoming destruction slicing through wind and smoke. But at the last possible moment, the American captain gave a furious command, spinning the wheel hard, tilting the battleship into a maneuver so violent it sent tools and helmets sliding across the deck, and the first enemy shell slammed into the water a hair's breadth off their port side, erupting in a geyser that drenched the gunners and rocked the hull. The second shell screaming past the bridge so close the shockwave shattered 2 windows, and the third slamming into the thickest part of the armor belt where the hull groaned under the hit but held strong, held defiant, held unbroken. And in that miraculous survival, the crew found their opening. The enemy had fired too soon, adjusted too late, exposed themselves for a critical second, and the American captain seized it with the reflexes of a man who had lived his entire naval career waiting for exactly such an impossible opportunity, ordering the guns to fire everything, every turret, every barrel, every ounce of fury the ship had left, turning the battleship into a blinding arc of fire and steel that blasted through the fog in a deafening eruption of flame, the recoil shaking the ship from bow to stern as the shells tore through the enemy hull with catastrophic force, shattering armor, igniting fuel lines, triggering a cascade of explosions deep inside the beast's belly. And for a moment the 2 ships were framed in a tableau of destruction, the enemy Titan buckling under the relentless onslaught, flames erupting along her decks, smoke pouring from her midsection in thick, oily plumes that twisted into the sky like dark serpents, her list growing worse as internal compartments failed. Yet still she fought back, still her surviving guns choked out rounds, though fewer now, slower now, as her crew scrambled desperately to contain fires and seal ruptures, their silhouettes flickering behind flames as chaos overtook discipline. And the American sailors watched this colossal struggle with a mixture of awe and disbelief, because they were witnessing something almost mythic, Two steel titans locked in a duel so brutal and intimate that the ocean itself seemed to recoil from the violence. Waves driven outward by the concussive force of repeated salvos, the waters boiling where hot shrapnel and burning oil splashed down. And through it all, the unrecognized American battleship kept pushing forward, kept firing, kept fighting as if fueled not by coal or oil, but by the raw, burning determination of the men who refused to let their ship be forgotten. And as the enemy Titan heeled further, smoke choking the sky above her, flames licking her tower mast, the captain saw the moment he needed, the final crack in the armor, the weakness exposed by relentless punishment, and he leaned forward, voice steady, issuing the command that would seal the fate of one of the greatest threats ever to prowl the Pacific, readying the final barrage that would either end this nightmare or plunge them into the ocean's unforgiving depths if they failed by even a second. And as the captain's final command cut through the roar of battle like a blade of iron resolve, the entire ship seemed to inhale, the engines throbbing in anticipation, the turrets locking into their final devastating alignment, the crew tightening their grips, steadying their stances, bracing themselves against bulkheads and railings as though preparing to ride the spine of a hurricane, because they all felt it. This was the moment. The razor's edge where victory and annihilation balanced so delicately that a single vibration, a single misalignment, a single heartbeat out of sync could send them plunging into the abyss. And as the enemy Titan struggled to regain orientation, its listing hull spitting smoke and sparks, its crew scrambling in chaos to bring damaged guns back into action, the American battleship unleashed her full, unrestrained fury, a final broadside so violent, so earth-shattering, so monstrously powerful that it seemed to tear the very air apart. Flames blasting from her barrels in blinding cones of light, shock waves rippling across the ocean in expanding rings as the massive shells streaked through the thinning fog like infernos hurled by ancient gods. And in those suspended seconds, seconds stretched by adrenaline and terror into something almost supernatural, the world grew silent. The enemy ship framed in smoke and flame, her wounded hull rising and falling with the waves as if gasping for breath. And then the shells struck one after another, in a chain of impacts that detonated with such catastrophic intensity that the enemy battleship convulsed violently, her steel plates buckling inward, her forward turret blown skyward in a plume of fire that lit the fog from within, turning the ocean surface a hellish shade of orange as internal explosions ripped through compartments deep below deck. Each blast a thunderclap that sent debris shearing outward, planks, metal shards, and pieces of rigging raining down on the water where they sizzled and sank. And the American sailors watched, stunned yet unflinching, as the Titan's superstructure crumpled like collapsing stone, her mast crashing sideways in a cloud of embers. Flames now roaring from every opening as fuel ignited, ammunition cooked off, and the giant that had once seemed invincible began to tilt sharply, her starboard side dipping dangerously low as seawater surged over the railings, flooding into wounds torn open by relentless American fire. And the great behemoth groaned, a deep, metallic, mournful sound that vibrated across the waves like the final sigh of a dying colossus. Her listing worsening into a fatal lean, her stern lifting as her bow sank, her propellers rising slowly into view like the exposed bones of some ancient beast dragged into the light. And the unrecognized American crew stood amid smoke and flame and flying embers, breathless, battered, drenched in salt water and sweat and soot, yet still gripping their stations with raw, unbroken determination as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The enemy Titan, the nightmare of the Pacific, the monster that dwarfed them in firepower and armor, slipping beneath the waves in a churning swirl of foam, oil and flame descending into the depths, with a slow, horrifying grace as though unwilling to accept defeat. And all the while the American battleship kept moving, kept firing, kept fighting through the final moments until the enemy hull disappeared completely into the dark blue abyss, leaving only burning debris, swirling smoke, and an eerie, haunting silence that settled over the Pacific like a shroud, broken only by the crackle of flames and the labored breathing of men who had given everything, muscle, nerve, blood, soul to survive the unwinnable, their ship scarred, burning, trembling, but still afloat, still defiant, still alive, and in this breathless aftermath, as the ocean calmed and the fog drifted like ghosts over the battlefield, the crew realized what they had accomplished. They had defeated a Titan, altered the fate of the Pacific convoy, and etched their forgotten warship into a legend that history would never properly honor, but that the sea itself would never forget. The moment sealed into the waves, into the steel of the hull, into the memories of every man aboard, a testament to courage so fierce it defied the very odds of war, marking the end of the most explosive opening engagement a battleship could ever fight. And as the smoke drifted into the open Pacific sky and the last embers of the fallen enemy Titan hissed against the waves, the battered, unrecognized American battleship steadied herself in the heaving ocean, her scarred hull groaning softly like a warrior catching his breath after surviving the impossible, the air thick with burnt metal, oil, and the echo of gunfire that still seemed to vibrate faintly through the decks as if the ship herself remembered every blow, every tremor, every scream of steel, and in that heavy silence, the crew looked out across the water. Men bruised, bleeding, soot-covered, exhausted beyond measure, yet standing tall, because they had lived through a nightmare few naval crews had ever faced, and the magnitude of what they had done settled slowly over them like a rising tide, an understanding that they had not just survived a battle, but rewritten the fate of the Pacific with their bare hands. Their grit, their defiance, their refusal to surrender even when outgunned, out-armored, and outmatched. And as the wind carried away the last wisps of smoke, the ocean around them shimmered with the eerie calm that follows annihilation, waves gently rocking the wounded ship as if acknowledging her victory, cradle-like and strangely tender, while deep inside the hull machinists tightened bolts, sealed ruptured pipes, and restarted systems through the blaze of emergency lamps, working tirelessly to steady the heart of the ship that had refused to die. And slowly, one by one, the sailors emerged from compartments, men from the engine rooms wiping sweat from their brows, deck gunners limping to rails, damage control teams dragging smoldering hoses, each face carrying the hollow, disbelieving look of someone who has stared into a storm built to crush them and somehow walked out alive. But there was no time for celebration, no applause, no medals to pin, because even as the enemy Titan sank into the abyss, a new dread began to whisper across the bridge. The radar was flickering again, the operator's trembling hand hovering over the screen as faint contacts appeared on the edge of detection, ghostly blips that pulsed in and out like beating hearts in distant darkness. And the captain, wiping soot from his brow, leaned over the console with the grim focus of a man who already knew the truth. War was never finished, never merciful, and the ocean did not grant victory without demanding something in return. And as the men stood ready, gripping rails and weapons despite their exhaustion, the fog that had begun to lift earlier rolled back across the sea as if drawn by unseen hands, a thick silver curtain swallowing the horizon and wrapping itself around the battleship in slow, deliberate spirals, turning the waters ghost-white and silent once again. And in that tightening mist, the crew felt the same foreboding chill they had felt at dawn, the same electric tension that had preceded the arrival of the Titan they had just defeated. For the ocean had grown too quiet, the air too still, the radar too hesitant, as though something enormous watched them from just beyond sight, something cold, something calculating, something waiting for them to weaken. And the captain, aware that his men were drained to their final reserves, stood tall on the bridge, back straight despite the cuts on his arms and the blood soaking his collar, his voice steady as he ordered the lookout teams to their stations, his mind replaying every sound in the fog, every distant vibration, every unnatural silence, because this was the Pacific, the vast, remorseless stage where victory could turn into disaster with a single misread signal. And though the crew had destroyed a Titan, the war did not allow legends to rest. And now the battleship, which history would never fully acknowledge, found herself alone again, drifting in fog thick enough to hide heaven or hell, her decks scarred, her guns overheated, her men trembling. yet her spirit still burning with the same ferocious courage that had carried her through the storm. And as the distant rumble began, a vibration so faint it felt like the ocean's heartbeat, the men leaned forward in dread and awe, because they recognized that sound now, recognized it with a coldness that seeped into their bones. Engines. Heavy ones, distant but approaching, the kind that belonged not to destroyers or cruisers, but something bigger, something slower, something monstrous. And in that suspended moment, as fog curled around the ship's superstructure and the sea went black beneath the gathering shadow, the crew understood with absolute clarity that their greatest battle might not be behind them, that the Pacific was not done testing the ship history ignored, and the final terrifying question hung in the air, not spoken, not asked, but pulsing in every man's chest. What was coming through the fog next?